The bear follows a young chef, Carmen Berzotto, as he leaves his job at a renowned Michelin star restaurant to take over his family's Italian beef sandwich shop called The Beef. The shop was formerly owned by Carmi's older brother Mikey, and through backstory we learn that Mikey was battling addiction and depression. At the show's start, Mikey has died, leaving Carmi to pick up the pieces of his brother's shattered life. These pieces include a dysfunctional family, a failing restaurant, a mountain of debt, and an unruly kitchen staff who are in no way prepared to function at Carmen's high standards. No one epitomizes this unruliness better than the character we want to talk about today, Richie, aka Cousin. But to talk about Richie, we first need to talk about how the show introduces his character.
Richie is introduced to us in a pivotal scene for his character and our protagonist, Carmen. I'll talk about why this scene is important later in the video, but first, let's discuss what happens in this scene. It's an argument. You'll find that a lot of Richie's defining moments come to us in the form of arguments because he is a reckless guy lashing out at a changing world. And change is at the heart of his first argument with Carmi. You see, Carmi has just taken over his brother's restaurant, The Beef, and he's trying to create a system in the kitchen that's more like the 5-star restaurants he's used to working in. The problem is that The Beef is not staffed by 5-star chefs, and they rebel against Carmi's rigid standards, with Cousin Richie leading the charge. Richie corners Carmi in the restaurant's walk-in freezer. Now, pause for a second because the setting of this argument is critical and we need to talk about it. What are the characteristics of a walk-in freezer? First and foremost, it's cold, but it's also dark, isolated, and dangerous. You can get locked in a freezer and die. The walk-in plays a pivotal plot point in the second season when Carmi fails to fix the handle and accidentally locks himself in it. More on that later though. Right now, we have an argument between two men who share a lot of the characteristics of the setting. They're cold, isolated, and shut off from the world around them. Richie's problem is that he's resisting change. Specifically, he's upset with the changes Carmen brings to the restaurant. In Richie's mind, The Beef is still Mikey's restaurant. He believes he's closer to Mikey and the rest of the Berzotto family than Carmen ever was because Carmen left to study and build his career. But that's just an excuse because Richie hates change, and he will use any excuse he can to stop it. So let's discuss why Richie hates change by examining his background and how his personal history shapes his motivation in the story.
Let's talk about Richie's background. Richie grew up an only child. His father was a staff sergeant in the army. We don't learn much about his mother, but at one point he says that he considers Carmi's mother, Donna, to be his surrogate mom. Richie was best friends with Carmen's brother, Michael, growing up, and spent a lot of his time around the Berzotto family and their house. Although they aren't related, Richie and Carmen refer to each other as cousin and consider one another to be family. Richie also has an ex-wife, Tiffany. They share a daughter, Eva. Richie is close to his daughter, but he doesn't see her often due to his divorce. It's unclear why Richie and his family split up, but he clearly has lingering feelings for his ex. We see this through the emotional reaction he has when Tiffany tells him that she's engaged to another man. Around the time of his failing relationship, Richie was hit with another tragedy, the death of his best friend Michael. In his freezer argument with Carmen, Richie claims that he was left to rebuild the Berzotto family while dealing with the collapse of his own because Carmen wasn't around to help. Obviously, Richie is dealing with a lot of personal upheaval in his life when Carmen shows up and decides to change everything about Richie's one constant, his job. Naturally, Richie wants to resist this change, and his character drives much of the conflict in season 1. Richie fights with Sydney, Carmen's newly hired sous chef. He distracts the staff and disrespects Carmen, and is generally unhelpful, choosing to stay out of the kitchen so he can chat it up with the regulars. But Richie isn't a jerk just to be one. There's a reason behind his sarcastic and grumpy attitude. So let's talk about Richie's motivation.
When we first meet Richie, he's a man who has lost everything. His wife has left him, his best friend is dead, and all he has left is the restaurant where he's spent most of his adult life. Then Carmen enters the picture and threatens to take that away from Richie. However, if we back up a bit, we discover Richie wasn't always stuck in his ways. In the flashback episode, Fishes, we meet a younger Richie who is still married and trying to make something of his life. While trying to convince Uncle Jimmy to give him a job, Richie says, "I don't want to spend the rest of my life wrapping sandwiches." We also see that Richie cares about his wife, bringing her Carmen's homemade 7-Up while she is pregnant and feeling nauseous. The couple shares a sweet moment alone that serves as a break for the viewer from the chaos of this episode. In the present day, we see Richie desperately trying to hold on to any shred of life he once had. After his divorce, Richie may think he wants things to stay the same at the restaurant, but that's not true.
By the way, if you're enjoying what you're seeing here, what should I say? By the way, if you're enjoying this video, right?
Yeah.
By the way, if you're enjoying this video, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. We post a lot of videos about
Character breakdowns. We post.
Okay. We do a lot of these character breakdowns, right? Yeah. That's good.
Now back to the video.
Now back to the video. What Richie needs. The best way to talk about Richie's needs is through the lens of a relationship with a character we haven't talked about yet, Sydney. Sydney is different from the other characters because she has no previous relationship with Richie. She has no affection for him, and she calls Richie out on his worst behaviors. Naturally, Richie and Sydney clash often and aggressively. As the new employee, Sydney represents the change that Richie is working against in Season 1. In the Season 1 episode, Cirrus, local gangsters shoot out the restaurant's windows. Richie talks to Sydney about changes in the neighborhood after a local bar shuts down, and he explains to Sydney that the change that she and Carmen are bringing will push out the local blue-collar workers who have been eating at the beef for years. Again, Richie expresses his fear of change and his desperate need to hold on to any fragment of his old life. Richie approaches the gangsters and tries to make a deal with them in exchange for information about the shooting. However, this causes a fight between two local gangs. Sydney calms the situation with free sandwiches, and Richie is threatened by her success and calls the police to arrest the gangsters. Sydney threatens Richie because she represents a threat to his place in the restaurant. In episode 1, Carmen relies on Richie to calm a mob outside the restaurant. Now that Sydney has shown herself competent with the locals, Richie has no place inside or outside the restaurant. This growing tension between the two characters leads to the fight.
Sydney and Richie's conflict culminates in the Season 1 penultimate episode, Review. While the restaurant is in crisis mode due to an overwhelming amount of to-go orders, Richie tries to step in and help the kitchen. But instead of asking where he's needed, he takes over Sydney's station. At first, she tells him to step away because he's not respecting the system that she's created in the kitchen. But Richie overreacts and tells Sydney that she's broken. So Sydney decides to tell Richie her unbiased opinion of him, that he's a loser and a waste of space in the kitchen. This may seem harsh, and it is, but Sydney is telling the truth at this point, because Richie has done nothing but cause conflict and disrupt the work that Sydney and Carmen are trying to do. And while Sydney and Carmen have their own problems, especially Carmen, they're only trying to improve things at the beef. Richie rejects any change, even what most people consider a positive change. This attitude is reflected in another interaction between Richie and Tina, another longtime cook at the beef. Tina, like Richie, initially rejected Carmen and Sydney's help, but gained respect for Sydney's professional attitude and willingness to teach Tina, despite their interpersonal conflict. Tina tells Richie that they finally have something good at the restaurant and that he should get out of the way if he doesn't want to be part of that. Ultimately, Richie's problem is that he's scared. He's afraid that change at the restaurant would mean that there's no place for him, that he'll get pushed out and lose the last thing left of his old life. And he's right. There isn't a place for Richie in the restaurant that Carmen and Sydney want to create. At least there's not a place for the old Richie. He has to evolve and change to remain part of the new world order. So let's discuss Richies Evolution.
In the final episode of Season 1, Richie and Carmen break up a brawl during a bachelor party at the restaurant. Richie almost kills a customer with a punch and is arrested. To his surprise, Carmen bails him out of jail. This is a new low point for both characters. Sydney and Marcus leave the restaurant after Carmen has a meltdown in the kitchen, but Richie realizes that despite their friction, Carmen loves him and is the only family he has left. Shortly after, Carmen discovers Michael's hidden money and Sydney and Marcus return. The staff recommits to Carmen and Sydney's vision of building a new world-class restaurant. The beef is the past, And these characters are ready to build a new and better future. This includes Richie, who now wants to support Carmen, although he is still scared of what change means for his place in the restaurant. At this point, Richie has overcome his biggest flaw from season 1. He's committed to change, but he's still scared. Richie tells Carmen that he's reading a book where a man who has no talent is cut off by all of his more capable friends. By the way, the book he's talking about, and I'm probably going to screw this up, is The Colorless Sakuri Tazaki, His Years of Pilgrimage. Richie is scared that what Sydney said during their fight is true, that he doesn't have a place in the new restaurant. Indeed, Richie's attitude and demeanor don't belong in a Michelin star restaurant. This causes him to try to help with the repairs, causing more trouble because, he's Richie. He argues with Fack, he tries to steal power from the neighbor, and he gives us one of the best lines of dialogue in the entire show. I'm not like this because I'm in Van Halen. I'm in Van Halen because I'm like this. Richie is so intrusive that Natalie, Carmen's sister, asks Carmen to do something about him. So Carmen sends Richie to stage at the Michelin star restaurant Ever. By the way, staging is what they call interning in the restaurant world, apparently. I didn't know that. Ever is where Carmen worked under the famous chef Terry, and this brings us to Richie's showcase episode, Forks. Forks is a standout episode of season 2, and it also serves as the pivotal moment of Richie's character arc. Richie enters Chef Terry's restaurant Ever as an immature and unfulfilled man, and leaves with what he's genuinely needed this whole time: purpose. He gains this purpose by learning 2 fundamental lessons. More on that later though. Let's talk about how the writers set up Richie for his drastic change. Going in, Richie is already a man who has been beaten. He's lost his family, his best friend, and he's struggling to find any purpose in life. But the writers reserved one final blow for Richie to suffer in this episode. During a smoke break, he gets a call from his ex-wife, Tiffany. She's calling to tell him that her new boyfriend proposed and that she said yes. This moment closes off any chance Richie has of returning to his former life. In terms of writing and his character development, this is really important. For Richie to want to change, he needs to be at his most vulnerable state. He has to have nothing left. He wants his old life back, but now there is no life to get back. It's been erased entirely, and the only way left is forward. Now that Richie is at his absolute lowest, he is finally ready to learn and move forward with his new life. So, what 2 lessons does Richie learn while staging at Terry's restaurant? Well, the first lesson is to talk less and to listen. When Richie is finally promoted from polishing forks, he shadows his new boss Garrett through the front of house. There's an essential piece of dialogue as Garrett tells Richie how the staff meticulously tailors each diner's experience in the restaurant. Richie asks how the waitstaff communicate if they can't talk to each other. The answer is they listen. They listen to the guests talk, pick up on nonverbal cues, and as Richie puts it in a later episode, enter a heightened state of sensitivity. It's here that Richie realizes that communication is a two-way street. For years, he's been a talker. Talking has been his greatest skill because he can be charming and funny, but he was missing the other half of the equation. He could never make authentic, meaningful connections with people because he wasn't listening to them. This flaw is at the heart of his friction with Carmen and Sydney. But once he learns how to listen, suddenly he's a fully functioning adult. That brings us to lesson 2. Service. Service is an ongoing motif with all of the characters in the show, and this plays into the theme that acts of service make work fulfilling and meaningful. We see the inverse of this theme in the episode Fishes, where Carmen's mom Donna serves food with the expectation that everyone feeds her ego. We see that that kind of work is never fulfilling because no amount of praise is enough for Donna. That kind of work fills us leaving empty and unfulfilled. Richie learns that true service is when your work serves to bring someone else joy. There is no better feeling than giving someone something they can't provide for themselves. That could be a joke that makes them smile, a Chicago-style deep dish pizza, or just a little support in the kitchen. When Richie learns to provide this kind of service, the work work is its own reward. These two lessons allow Richie to return to the bear as a changed man. He can now provide the kind of support and service that transforms him into a true asset for the people around him. But there's still one more lesson that he needs to learn. And this brings us to his argument with Carmen in the freezer, because this final lesson is one that Carmen has yet to learn as well.
Richie's final lesson. Richie embraces a new role, leading front of house at the restaurant. He even takes on some of Natalie's duties, which is narratively satisfying because he goes from being her most significant burden to being a pillar of support. I especially love the scene where they interview waitstaff and Richie turns a napkin sideways to see if the applicant would fix it. Then he's completely appalled when she doesn't even notice. Richie now mirrors Carmen's dedication to order and perfection in the restaurant, but his actual test comes during the restaurant's soft opening when Carmen locks himself in the freezer and Sydney is left alone to run the kitchen. Up to this point, Sydney has been the expo, the person responsible for coordinating and communicating orders between the kitchen staff and the serving staff, ensuring that dishes are prepared and presented correctly and delivered to the customers on time. The role is crucial for maintaining efficiency and smooth operations in a restaurant kitchen. One of the new kitchen staff wanders off, and now Sydney has to prepare orders. At this point, Richie sees what needs to be done and asks Sydney if he can take over at Expo. This is a crucial moment for both characters as they haven't interacted since their last fight in season 1. That was when Richie took over Sydney's station without asking, and later, she accidentally stabbed him in the ass. Now, Richie is asking if he can take this burden from Sydney, if he can truly support her and do things her way. Richie's never run an Expo before. He's only seen it done while staging at Ever. But clearly, he was taking notes because he executes it flawlessly. Richie and Sydney get every dish out and save the dinner service. Richie instructs his friend Fack to take charge at the front of house, a task Fack hesitates to accept, given his lack of experience in the role. Richie responds with a reassuring question, "Do you think I've ever done this before?" referring to the challenging position of Expo. Feeling a genuine sense of fear, Fack confides in Richie that he's scared. In a touching moment, Richie responds by firmly grasping Fack's face. With genuine sincerity, Richie imparts a crucial message, saying, "Don't be scared." With those words, Richie not only addresses Fack's immediate apprehension, but also imparts a broader lesson about facing challenges with courage and confidence. Once a chaotic battleground, the kitchen now feels like a place of shared understanding and support. Once confused and broken, Richie's life is now filled with purpose and meaning. Let's talk about one last argument. Richie's triumph at the Expo sets up the final confrontation of season 2, his argument with Carmen, who's still locked in the freezer. Remember how we discussed the freezer's importance as a setting at the beginning of this video? Here's the payoff as we get this dramatic shot of Carmen and Richie on opposite sides of the freezer door. Richie is upset at Carmen after he sees Claire, who's a doctor and also Carmen's girlfriend, leaving the kitchen in tears. His disappointment in Carmen intensifies after he learns that Carmen essentially tells her that he shouldn't be with her because he doesn't need her. In truth, Carmen has been in love with this girl since middle school, and Carmen is scared of needing anybody. He's scared that a relationship will distract him, and any distraction will cause his business to fail. He's worried that any happiness in his life will come at the cost of his career. And that's why Carmen is still in the freezer, waiting for another shoe to drop. But our boy Richie has escaped the freezer. And that's because he's learned that one vital lesson that Carmen hasn't. Don't be scared. All right, so obviously like one of our favorite lines from the show is, I'm not like this because I'm in Van Halen. I'm in Van Halen because I'm like this. So if you like The Bear and you want to talk about it, tell us what your favorite lines from the show are in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video and you learned something, be sure to come back. We drop new videos like this all the time. All right, see you soon.